Is this microphone on? Great. Well, thanks everybody for coming. It's quite overwhelming to see all of you here. And to my Somali friends, I hope I get this right. I just want to say Wad Mahad Santi. And to give you an idea of the book that I've written, I thought that I'd read you an excerpt from it that is trying to show Somalia is not all about pirates and al-Qaeda linked terrorists and starving people. That those things are there, but there's a whole lot of other things too. And this passage refers to a time last year when in one day I visited two very different parts of the country. Visiting the two Somalias in a single day is quite an experience. The Somalia of Mogadishu is not a relaxing place to be. The city is heavily militarized and divided, its front lines constantly changing. Civilians are never safe, even from the African Union peacekeepers who've been accused by human rights groups of firing heavy artillery into civilian areas. People's behavior is severely restricted. In areas controlled by Islamist insurgents, women have to cover themselves completely. The other Somalia is a world apart. I took the plane from Mogadishu to Somaliland's port town of Berbera in the northwest, where I took a walk on the beach. There I saw a group of young women frolicking in the sea, rolling about in the water, kicking their legs in the air, giggling, laughing and shrieking in delight. It was as if a lid had been taken off a pot of boiling water. People were allowed to breathe and express themselves freely. Unlike in the Somalia of Mogadishu, there were no African Union peacekeepers. There was just peace. It was on that day, as I was sitting in the lobby of a hotel in Somaliland, that I was told about al-Shabaab's latest ruling, which banned men and women from shaking hands in public. It was early evening, and all around me in the hotel were Somali men and women, gathering to drink tea, talk politics, and watch football on TV. Men dressed in colourful sarongs, flicking richly embroidered shawls over their shoulders, greeted the brightly dressed, bejewelled women by not only shaking their hands, but lightly kissing them, as is the traditional Somali way. The mood of the evening was light and romantic. Men graciously quoted Somali poems to their female companions. Earlier that day, in Mogadishu, the only women I saw were hidden away under thick, dark robes. So that was one of the sort of aims, I suppose, of this book, is that, as Richard said, I've been covering Somalia for about 20 years, really from the time when the central government collapsed in early 1991. And I wanted to somehow get behind and beyond the myths that we read about in Somalia in the newspapers. And I suppose also partly to do what the BBC has taught me, and that I have immense gratitude really to the BBC for this, is that I've tried to do sort of fair and balanced reporting on what I've seen in Somalia, not just following the headlines and the stereotypes. And maybe, I don't know, I mean, it's not really my job as a journalist, but maybe this story that I'm telling about Somalia will also let policymakers and aid workers and other people know that there are some positive and amazingly original and unique things going on in Somalia that could be used as models for a future. And maybe those are better models than these outside interventions and the conferences that we've had so many of, and another one's coming up in just a couple of weeks' time. And writing this book took me on an incredible journey, because one of the headlines that we read about Somalia is that it's a failed state. It actually, in the last 4 years, it's come top of the list of the world's most comprehensively failed states. And it's true, Somalia has been without any effective central authority for more than 20 years. And life is difficult, miserable, dangerous for lots of people there. But there's another side to the story, and that's particularly in the economy, where I discovered in both traditional and sort of super modern spheres, things are really booming. And I'm not going to give you lots of boring statistics here, but I'll just give you one. The livestock trade, which has been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, in the first 10 years after the fall of central government, the sale of livestock from Somalia into northern Kenya grew by 600%. So that just goes to show that a country with no government doesn't necessarily mean a country where nothing works. It might also surprise some of you who haven't been to Somalia to know that it has one of Africa's most effective and cheap mobile phone systems, and it's also home to the biggest money transfer company in Africa. So there's lots of extraordinary things happening there. Another thing that I wanted to do, I suppose another aspect of Getting Somalia Wrong, was to talk about outside intervention, which seems to have failed so spectacularly so many times. And I thought that I'd start with the US-led fiasco of the early 1990s, which, even though originally it was actually quite a successful humanitarian effort which opened up corridors, it ended in disaster with the withdrawal of the Americans and the United Nations. But as I read and talked to people, I found out that actually that was just the latest in a long, long stage of sort of international interventions that hadn't worked in Somalia, and that a bit like Afghanistan, Somalis have been giving outsiders a pretty hellish time for decades. In particular, there was somebody called the Mad Mullah. I'm sure many of you have heard of him, this warrior poet, the Sayyid, who fought against the British colonialists and others from 1900 till 1920. And this was actually the first time Britain ever used warplanes in Africa, was against him. So in a way, these American drones and Kenyan warplanes that are bombing Somalia today, it's nothing new, it's just an endless pattern. So I kind of wish that people would read a bit of history when it comes to Somalia, and they might stop repeating the same strange mistakes. Another thing that I talk about, and I'll just mention this very briefly, is how 9/11 had a massive impact on Somalia, and I'm sure that many Somalis here who try to travel anywhere have a hard time, because so many of them, somehow the outside world sees Somalia now through this prism, post 9/11 prism. And in a way, by looking at Somalia like that, they have created a monster in Somalia in the form of al-Shabaab and other Islamist insurgent groups. And it's my argument really is that by viewing groups in Somalia as these al-Qaeda-linked terrorists before they were, sort of pushed some of them towards becoming just that. And it was just today, actually, that the Royal United Services Institute said that the biggest danger to this country where we are now is a lone wolf terrorist, possibly a Somali, coming and causing problems for us here. So now it has become a real threat. So my conclusion really in the book was that there are things that work, and there are three models that I think people should really pay attention to. And I'm sure some of you aren't going to like me for saying this, but I think the model of Somaliland, which is a self-declared independent country, even though it hasn't been recognised by anyone, I think that example is one that means a lot, that could be useful for the rest of Somalia. I also think that a union of Islamic courts that took power for a brief 6 months in southern Somalia, before the Americans and the Ethiopians decided it was some al-Qaeda monster and destroyed it, I think that was also another sign of hope, because they actually brought peace, and they did actually do something about piracy. And then I think, maybe more than anything else, I actually think it's the Somali business community that has proved so successful I sometimes think maybe these people holding this conference on the 23rd of February should speak to the business community, because they know how to make things work in Somalia, instead of these politicians who seem to have made a very profitable business out of making Somalia not work. I'd also really now, I'll end by thanking the people who've helped me write this book, and really it might have been me who sat down in the library in SOAS or the British Library to write it, but it really contains the voices and the knowledge of lots of Somali friends and colleagues and other experts. And one of those people who's helped me more than almost anyone is my colleague Mwalimu. I don't know if he's here yet, but he's coming. He's normally based in Mogadishu, and I just want to read something, a short piece from the book, which tells you how Mwalimu helps me and something about his character. So this is just another short excerpt from the book. One person in Mogadishu to whom I speak almost every day is the BBC reporter Mohammed Mwalimu. After we greet each other, he gives me a rundown of what's happened that day. In a business-like way, he informs me how many people have been killed, the number of wounded, and whether any of them are children or pregnant women. He tells me who started the fighting, how heavy it is, and for precisely how many hours and minutes it has lasted, sometimes holding the phone up so I can hear the gunfire and the pounding of shells. He's always calm, measured, and gracious. But one day he called me at home, sounding shaken and upset. Instead of the usual efficient few minutes, he spent a long time talking to me. He described how he'd been to see a group of people who'd been forced out of their homes by the authorities, who then demolished their properties, saying they'd been used as al-Shabaab hideouts. He said he'd found the families gathered in an open area, living without shelter on the bare earth. There he'd seen a little boy. What was upsetting Mwalimu so much was that this boy had fashioned a gun out of a wooden stick and was playing with it. Somehow this, something little boys do all over the world, upset him more deeply than the awful consequences of violence he sees nearly every day. And when I went to work the next day, I found an email from Mwalimu with a photo attached. I opened it and saw a little boy dressed in red, playing with his pretend gun in the sand. So it's people like Mwalimu I really want to thank, because without their courage and their honesty, this book wouldn't exist. And there's another person, I don't know, I know he said he was coming, another colleague from the Somali service, Mohammed Ade, who tirelessly helped me. We used to go and make phone calls to strange people at 6 o'clock in the morning on Sundays and things, and he was always there for me, and I'm so grateful to him and to all my other colleagues at the Somali service at the BBC. Other people who've been absolutely inspirational and who got me started are the series editors, Alex Duval and Richard, sitting here. And the person, in a way, I want to thank most of all is my editor, Stephanie. Because without Stephanie, I wouldn't have written this book. She really, really believed in me, and she got me going, and she just saw me through the whole process. So thank you, Stephanie. And also thank you to Ken Barlow of Z Press, who was the commissioning editor. He always cast a very intelligent, measured eye on my writing. And I want to thank everyone else at Z Press, especially Ruvani de Silva. I also want to thank Ian Hoare, who has a ferocious eye for spelling mistakes and bad English, and he really kept me going, encouraging me constantly. And to my many, many Somali friends, there's two I need to mention in particular, Mohammed Ado and Abdurrashid Douale. And then last of all, I want to thank my family. I suppose it was my mother who started me on this journey, because she was a nurse in Mogadishu in the early 1990s, and she was the only one of the few people who had a phone. So when I started working at the BBC, I had a hotline to the war. So it's thanks to Mum and Save the Children, really. And to my dad, who is quite a fierce, exacting character, but he expects a lot from his children. And thank you, Dad, for always wanting more out of us. And to his wife, Ushi, and also to my siblings, my cousins, my nieces and nephews, some of whom are here today. And especially to my children, Johnny and Antonia, and I think they're totally sick of Somalia, and I doubt they'll ever read this book because it took me away from them for so long. So sorry to my children, and thank you to everyone else, and to all of you for coming. Thank you so much.